Ancient Evenings. Wait, Prelude? This is Prelude to Ulysses, where Alex reads Ancient Evenings by Norman Mailer. We are on part 5. The last chapter was pretty wild, man. Yeah, Set and Horace got into a little scuffle, and Horace came out the victor. Part 5. Horace slept well. It was a night for celebration, and the gods cheered every appearance of Isis and Osiris. For the first time in years, the Lord of the Dead offered the touch of 2 fingers to his wife's elbow, an old gesture to tell of carnal desire in the midst of formal ceremony. But Isis felt a foreboding that had little to do with pleasure. "Do you know," said Osiris, "the boy was better than I expected?" And decided one virtue of this victory was that it enabled him to feel love for his son. I am worried Set will escape," Isis answered. And later, when they tried to sleep, she was restless and went off to walk in the night, while Osiris tried to meditate on the source of her uneasiness. He saw the face of his first son, Anubis, and sighed as quietly as a leaf listening to the approach of a light wind. In that sigh was the recognition by Osiris that his mind might be as pure as silver and luminous as the moon, but his talents for divination could never be applied to any matter concerning Set. He had lost that power on the night he made love to Nephthys. One did not torture the feelings of a brother without disturbing every composure of the deep. Now, when Isis reached the field where Set was pinioned in his bonds, she dismissed the guard and sat in the moonlight. Set made no sign at her appearance. Exhaustion hung in tatters on his presence, so it was not easy to tell him of his crimes nor the grim years he had caused. Instead, Isis found herself brooding over the young and naked body of her sister Nephthys, next to the body of Osiris, and felt herself shaking with surprising rage. "I suffer," Isis said to herself, "for all those who are deadened by evil copulations." And she could feel no wrath at her brother, only the strength of the silence between them. Now she heard Set say, "Sister," and cut my bonds. She nodded. She felt meek. Beneath the light of the moon, Isis cut the ropes from Set, and he rose slowly from the ground and, looking at her, made the curious and childlike move of putting his thumb into his mouth. Sparks flew from his fingers, and she saw his strength return. Then Set saluted and walked away. Now Isis knew a little of what she had done, but this unforeseen generosity to Set, she had begun to pay for it, ignoring the sacrifice suggested by Mot. So she could not return to Osiris, but wandered through the night and did not care what happened to her. And in the morning awakened with bad thoughts of his mother. Horace crossed the field to find that his uncle was gone. Poor Horace, until this battle his emotions had tasted no better than the food of peasants who toil in caves. Roots, grubs, and smoked beetles were the nourishment of his heart. Now he had been to the feast of his own triumph. He was a man whose temper blazes for the first time in righteousness. "Where is my mother?" he roared in a voice to recall the worst voice of Set, and who did not hear. Nor did he have any trouble in finding her. The eyes of those who had seen Isis pass looked away. He could determine the direction she had taken by observing the back of everyone's head. And in the woods he soon found her. "Who has released my enemy?" he asked. Then Isis was afraid, yet she answered, "Do not speak in such a tone to your mother." He had heard the fear she hoped to conceal, and on the instant I raised his sword and cut off her head. He heard the fear she hoped to conceal, and on the instant raised his sword and cut off her head. "Now that I am victorious, I will never hesitate again. he started to say, but burst into tears instead, and wept with more grief than he had ever known. Picking up the head of his mother, Horus ran into the wilderness. On the instant, what was left of Isis turned into a statue of flint. In such a headless state would she remain? It is possible Osiris never knew a greater test of his understanding. Uh-oh, got lost. It is possible that Osiris never knew a greater test of his understanding. While he could perceive his wife's act as a godly response to some warp in the order of things, it could not be said he felt forgiveness toward Horus. I was right, thought Osiris, not to trust my son with savage temper. Conceived out of the chill of my corpse, he is wild as a weed. The future lord of the living is wild as a weed, he repeated Osiris. And he was not given to repetition. But he did not know what to do. Hideous was the prospect of being wed forever to a headless statue. Indeed, how could one avenge such a wife? Yet, he could not leave Horus unpunished. That would invite chaos, so Osiris gave word that his son must be pursued. Set was the first to take up the chase. He went out as a middle-aged warrior, hardly healed from his wounds. He had, however, regained confidence, for when Isis cut his bonds, he felt as if a great power was released from her and given to him. And he prayed for noble and exalted strength. To the Hidden One he said, Monarch of the Invisible, allow me a magnification of this great power that Isis releases by betraying her son. Let lightning be as 5 hands where once it was 5 fingers. The heavens answered in a quiet voice. Put the thumb that still belongs to you in your mouth. And Set did as he was told. I wonder who's talking. And felt balm come to his wounds. And his 8 free fingers gave off sparks. So he was confident when he went out to look for Horus. There was no battle, however. Set came upon a youth who sat in the stupor of grief. Set did not waste the opportunity. Immediately he plucked out Horus's eyes, and indeed they were still weak from the wounds of war. As Horus ran about in a circle, for blindness came upon him in a whirlwind of pain, a stroke of lightning more deranged than the fall of a great stone shivered the earth, and the blood-red sockets of Horus's face showed as green as the brilliance of grass. Set felt a fear of the force given to him by his prayer, and gave up all attempts to kill Horus. Instead, he grasped the head of Iris and ran away. Horus, seeking to pursue, stumbled off a cliff at the edge of the wood and wandered in blindness through the desert. By then, Set was far off. Having been granted this success, Set was not free of the awe he felt before these new powers. So he took the eyes of Horus from the pouch in which he kept them and planted those eyes in the ground. And even as he watched, they grew and became the lotus, which plant had never been seen before. And this lotus was soon to proliferate and become the royal plant of the pharaohs. Watching, Set was tempted, however, to desecrate the head of his sister. The voice that had told him to suck his thumb was now mocking him. You are too kind to your enemies, said that voice. Do not weaken what lives in the roots of your temper. Befoul her, pollute her flesh. From his anus to his navel, Set was one godly churn. The head of his phallus was a plum ready to burst. Lust was the purest impulse he knew, to paint semen on another. But in fear he forced himself away, and in a convulsion, masturbated over a field of lettuce. "Oh," murmured the voice, "you have made a mistake." Set did not listen. What masturbator does? Chilled, subdued, he quit those silent, bespaddled vegetables and came back to Memphis. But on every day that followed, his hunger to gorge on lettuce had become as great as his taste for meat. So soon as he returned, Set presented the head of his sister to her statue. Isis did not trust the gift. Mute and incarcerated in stone, still she could feel that the head was contaminated. Thoth, who had been serving as her doctor while other gods were off in search of Horus, was also dubious. Thoth, with his thin arms and baboon face, might be the least virile of the gods. He was married to Mat, but he also was the chief of the scribes and lord of words. Of course he would be the one to know how to speak to a statue. Having been alone with Isis for many hours, he began to put his hands on the flint with subtle strokes. So Isis began to converse. When it came to such matters, Thoth had the finest ears. After he laid a finger on the stone, he knew how to receive the reply. It was in the quality of the silence, but how many have ears to distinguish between one silence and another? Since the statue of Isis was without eyes to weep, tears could only flow from her breast. That is to say, moisture appeared at each nipple. Thoth placed his bare hands there. During this vigil, he had grown familiar with her shape, and if he knew nothing of the smoothness of Isis's skin, which was finer than the patina of marble, Thoth's fingers enjoyed the rough flint. Like many a scribe to follow, he was not comfortable with the undulations of women. Irritation was more stimulating to his mind. Whenever some fires of incense were lit, his lungs would look for the harshest smoke. A small damage to the flesh improved his ability to think. Just so, his fingers even showed a blister here and there when they had fretted too long at the stone. While holding her, Thoth would often place his forehead against her thigh. He would ponder what he wanted to ask and try to compose the question with such purity of mind that the thought could reach into the mute recesses of the flint. Then Isis would sooner or later reply, not, however, by words. Pictures would come instead to his mind, misty at first. But sometimes this fog would dissipate, and Thoth would see her response in an unmistakably clear image. Now when he inquired if she would like the head returned to her body, the flint presented no more than a muddy river to his mind. Too muddy, that is, for vision, until Thoth was given one wholly unpleasant view of the buttocks of Set in the midst of defecation. The flint had given its opinion of the head. This vehemence left Thoth unsettled. Still, he tried to let his next thoughts flow quietly. He suggested that while she might no longer desire her own face, Still, the heads of many birds, animals, insects, or flowers might be satisfactory. Her reply made him wait, but at last he was encouraged to wander in his mind down a jungle trail. Thoth, too sedentary for long marches, walked in. Thoth, too sedentary for long marches, watched in wonder while strange animals and birds flashed in front of his closed eyes. He had never seen land so green, nor hills so steep. Huge insects crawled into his vision, and leaves of papyrus waved. Then he saw the horns of a gazelle, then a cobra. Now a herd of cows came forth to graze, and as he moved towards this herd, only one cow remained in sight. He could see nothing but the cow's head. Lovely and soft was this cow's head. Then Thoth heard the first sound ever to issue from stone. A ruminative voice, full of the flavor of grass, came forth. And as he opened his eyes, the flint was returning to flesh, and Isis was before him in all the beauty of her own body. Younger by years after this incarceration in stone, no longer headless, and she had the small and comfortable horns of a fine cow. And now, and the new name of Isis was Hathor. Thoth could not keep from touching her. If he was never guilty of excessive fornication, dry as the feather of Mot had been his small itch. Still, he was now as unstrung as a cat in heat. So Hathor, in recompense for his long labors, allowed him to rub against her. The touch of real flesh put a rent, however, in his sluices, and he spewed all over her flank. She was kind, and wiped his face, offered one kiss of a massively lolling tongue, and departed in search of her son. Yum. It proved no long search. The sound of Horus's cries reverberated through the desert. Blind, bewildered, his heart bruised, he lay near a grove by a spring and moaned in a voice that seemed small to himself, yet it was so pure in its burden that his mother could hear it from many hills away. And when she finally reached his sightless body, she had a seizure of pity as if her blood had passed through his sorrow. Horus was surrounded by a field of lotus. It had flowered out of the first lotus that grew from his eyes, and a gazelle was feeding on the leaves. Isis, without hesitation, took milk from this gazelle. The animal never retreated as the goddess approached, for Isis was in the head of Hathor. And when did a gazelle have fear of a cow? Indeed, the animal barely knew she was being milked. She assumed the strange cow merely wished to pay homage, and did not know, poor cow, how to begin. Now, discovering that nothing was desired of her but milk, the gazelle, none so secretly in vain as the gazelle, stamped her front paws on Hathor's breast, then in a panic at her daring, rushed off. Hathor went up to Horus and licked his face. Washing gazelle's milk all over those outraged sockets where his vision had been. Delicately, she uncovered his loincloth, so that the breeze which rose from the spring might soothe his parts. Even as the milk gave balm to his empty sockets, and indeed this tender wind on his loins offered peace to the harsh, blood-crusted void above his nose. Horus, receiving these caresses, felt seeds beginning to germinate where once his eyes had been. He wondered if flowers could grow from his brow, and he reached up to touch these petals. But instead, through a waterfall of blood and tears and pearly milk, saw his own 2 hands, and cried aloud, "My mother has forgiven me!" And the next instant, he saw the sad, luminous eyes of Hathor, and smelled her great tongue, with the odor of earth and grass licking at his brows. Then he could only say, "How can I forgive myself?" She put a finger on his brow to convey the answer. Whatever he prized most had to be offered to his father. And Horace wondered what he could give up. Even as he asked himself, he looked out on the desert, and it was uncommonly beautiful. The rocks were the color of rose, and the sands a powder of gold. Whenever light gleamed on stone, he saw gems. Beholding a beauty of such generosity, Horace no longer debated. "Oh, father," he said, in his desire to utter each word with dignity, "I, Horace, your son, have been returned my eyes, in order that I may offer them to you." Ooh! Woo! The new vision of Horace fell into darkness, and the loss reverberated like boulders crashing in a gorge. When he opened his eyes once again, his sight was restored. But there was all the difference in his view. To his left eye, each color was still resplendent, yet his right eye saw the depth of gray in every stone. When both eyes looked out together, the world did not appear beautiful nor hideous, but well balanced. So he could see Isis in all the loveliness of her body and the shock of her broad cow's head. "Let us go back," she said sadly. And they returned holding each other's hand. "I can tell you," said Mendenhedit, in a sharp tone of voice, that as soon as they entered the walls of Memphi, Horace's eyes were put to a new test. In his simplicity of mind to a greater one, Osiris had decided that Horus and Set must stand before him. Woo, baby! All right, that was nuts. Isis deciding to free Set, then confronted by her son Horus and decapitated. Wow. And then Thoth. I don't really know who that is. Well, let's take a minute. Let's look up Thoth. Anyone who gives a shit can hang up right now. Thoth, then Thoth, who is the husband of Mot, Thi. Lmnopqr. No Thoth, huh? I don't know, buddy. Thoth, who is some... I don't know who Thoth is. Thoth is not... It's definitely a relative of Mot. Why is Thoth not in the dictionary? Okay, Thoth decides to... No, so Isis has turned into a statue. Her body, her decapitated body, anyways. Because she's like kind of just like dropped out of existence, sort of. And then he slowly brought her back to life by learning how to speak with the dead through reverberations and silence, and his overly incel-y attitude. Because Thoth's girl, her name is Mot. She's a feather from a bird who got hot. He's just been a bit sexually deprived, it seems like. Seems like having a love life with a feather is maybe not as easy as it sounds. But slowly, through his passion and ability to hear the differences in silence, could hear what Isis wanted. And Isis, wait, what did Isis want then? She didn't want her head, she wanted a different head. The head of a female cow. She went, oh yeah, and then Set went out and finished the job and pulled out fucking Horus's eyes again. She finds Horus in the middle of the desert or wherever looking for his eyeballs, and she gifts him some eyeballs. They grow like lotus flowers in his eyeballs. And he's like, oh my God, my mom, who I fucking decapitated, is forgiving me. How could I forgive myself? And she says, the only way you can do that is by offering your father your greatest, whatever you care about the most. And he was like, okay. Couldn't think about it. And he's like, well, I guess it's my eyes. I keep losing them, and it's a real big deal. So he offers his eyes up to, I think, Osiris. And, oh yeah, with his new eyes, he can, like, see purity, or just, like, everything is absolutely gorgeous. He has some type of cosmic vision that can see the best in everything. And he's prepared to lose all of that, which is pretty amazing. But instead, he's given beauty in his left eye and balance and like the grayness of his left eye. So he's kind of caught right in the middle. And then what happens at the end? And they start walking back. But Osiris has already heard of his son's misdeeds. Misdeeds being murdering his mom. And it looks like they're going to have another problem. That was fun. This book is... It gets a little gross, but it gets real gross. But it's super fun. Tune in next time.